Good morning, everybody. My name is Tom Kozerski, and I am Program Manager for the Montana Department of Commerce's Energy Promotion and Development Office, and going to be providing you with some kickoff remarks here this morning for our Bioenergy Workshop 2009. We're very appreciative for everybody coming to this event this morning, and will be here with us for most of the next 2 days to talk about the very important topic of bioenergy development in the state of Montana. And of course, energy development is something that is extremely important. And I think that the size of the turnout here, the spectrum represented here of different interests, the high level of people. Governor Brian Schweitzer with us today. Governor's cabinet officials, most of them are here today. We've got individuals who are federal program leaders and heads from federal agencies have come all the way from Washington, D.C. to be with us here for the next couple of days. And so I think that really underscores the importance of what we're going to undertake here in the next couple of days. It's a jam-packed agenda. We are loaded with experts here from the field of bioenergy, from biofuels to transportation fuels to bioenergy and biomass utilization for combined heat and power, gasification, you name it, forestry officials. We think this is going to be a very exciting event that's going to be very interesting. And we are going to ask you to really put your thinking caps on because tomorrow, toward late morning and into the early afternoon, we're going to really take all these topics that we're going to be discussing for the next day and a half, learning about from the experts, and we're going to have 3 sessions of breakouts where we're going to talk about bioenergy development in the state of Montana and how we can advance it. We want to be able to give Governor Schweitzer a roadmap to explain how we're going to take energy development in the bioenergy field in this state forward, to give the governor the direction that the experts in the field at least can provide him some information that's going to help him move ahead. So we really want you to be prepared to participate, and so we're very excited about this. We're very pleased to partner with the Western Governors Association on this, and we have really pulled all the stops in terms of state participation, all the way from the governor's office through the Department of Environmental Quality, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, the WIRED program. We've got all the brain power in the state of Montana, state government, to be here at this conference, and so we're very excited and looking forward to collaborating with the Western Governors Association on this. And I guess I'd like to talk about briefly energy development in a broader context. Last week I was at the American Wind Energy Association conference in Chicago. And that conference has grown to over 23,000 participants. 23,000. And a couple of years ago it was around 8,000 in Los Angeles. It's practically tripled. And in spite of the fact that the economy's in a downturn, we're in a bad recession, the predictions for wind energy development are scaling up. And I think that really is indicative of the importance of energy development to this country, to this state. It's an extremely important topic. And I think we're at the heart of what is going to be one of the fundamental industries, fundamental aspects of our planet, frankly, of us moving forward, climbing out of this economic recession that we're in. And it's going to take a broad portfolio of energy development technologies, energy sources. It's all got to be developed in order for us to become a more secure country, a secure state, one that's economically prosperous. So with that, I'd like to say thank you again for coming. I do want to thank all the folks on the staff of the Energy Promotion Office, Chantel McCormick, Linda Pelagi, and Sarah Desmond, who worked very hard on this, along with the staff of the Western Governors Association, Alex Schroeder in particular, to put this great event together. And really wouldn't have happened without their hard work. And so with that, I'd like to introduce to you the Executive Director for the Western Governors Association, who's come to be with us today out of Denver, Pam Inman.
Thanks, Tom. Well, this is a great turnout for the beginning of many workshops throughout the West that WGA will be co-hosting, and I want to thank you all for coming. I would also like to thank Governor Schweitzer and his staff for all the hard work that they've put into this meeting, and we look forward to some really great outcomes with your input. The WGA Bioenergy and Biofuels workshops underscore so many issues that are often at the crux of what governors deal with on a daily basis, encouraging economic and rural development, increasing our energy independence, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions in light of climate change, and protecting our forests are all important challenges that the Western governors have been working on for quite a few years. Bioenergy can play a key role in diversifying the West's energy mix. The 2006 WGA Clean and Diversified Energy Advisory Committee report detailed that there is a potential for 10,000 megawatts of energy coming from biomass by 2015. Last year's WGA Transportation Fuels Report and Biofuels Assessment predicted that we could be producing over 11 billion gallons of biofuels and biodiesel by 2015, and a majority of that would come from advanced technologies and cellulosic feedstocks. We do face challenges as we develop our biomass resources, but these reports clearly show that the potential is there, and events like this workshop will help identify and overcome some of those barriers. It will be important to remain out front in bioenergy and provide input to federal legislation to ensure that the Western perspective is heard. The Western governors have been leaders in coming up with solutions for energy policy and have been steadfast in their call for a comprehensive national energy plan. In November 2008, the governors drafted a letter to then President-elect Obama, and Governor Schweitzer and Governor Huntsman met with his administration prior to his inaugural to discuss a number of measures to transform the country's energy infrastructure and economy while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The letter outlines policies and incentives that would help states and the country move more aggressively to develop clean and renewable energy resources that include solar, wind, biomass, geothermal, hydro, and clean fossil fuels with carbon capture storage. The governors also identified energy policy principles and goals that should be part of a national energy plan, including the establishment of a national greenhouse gas emissions reduction goal and mandatory market-based program, the establishment, and I think this is really key for this group, the establishment of an oil import reduction goal to strengthen our energy security and our independence, measures that support workforce development and clean energy jobs, and substantial public and private investment in our nation's energy research and development portfolio. WGA has several standing committees of governors' designees that continue to monitor these issues and those that surround the development of bioenergy. WGA's Transportation Fuels Council was established last year to implement the governor's policies on alternative fuels. The council has been meeting regularly over the past year and will be issuing a report to the governors at the upcoming meeting in June. The WGA's Forest Health Advisory Committee is establishing a biomass subcommittee to discuss how we balance the need to promote healthy forests, mitigate the risks of wildfire, and develop biomass as a sustainable energy resource. We also participate in the National Biomass Partnership with several other regional governors associations to ensure that we are coordinating our efforts. On the electricity side, WGA is partnering with the U.S. Department of Energy and stakeholders across the region to identify Western Renewable Energy Zones, or REZs. Each REZ will seek to identify needed transmission for location-constrained renewable energy resources in a way that mitigates impacts on wildlife and the environment. All of these efforts will certainly be enhanced by what we hear from all of you over the next 2 days, and I'm looking forward to that discussion. I would like to acknowledge and thank the Energy Foundation, Katie McCormick sitting in the back, the U.S. Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Labor for their support of these workshops, as well as the state departments that Tom mentioned, and you, Tom, for all your hard work into this. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce the Vice Chairman of WGA, who will become chair next month. Immediately following his election in 2004, Governor Schweitzer assumed an active role with his colleagues at WGA. Governor Schweitzer is the current vice chair, and as I mentioned, in June will become chair. We will have our annual meeting in 2010 here in Montana in June, so watch for that. It's going to be a great meeting. We can always count on the governor to present the facts with a dash of humor, ask compelling questions, and do his best to keep the federal government honest. He is a regular at WGA meetings, and we always have a table tent ready for JAG, just in case he joins us. I certainly look forward to his continued involvement and leadership at WGA and over the next year as chair, and I'm honored to introduce him today. Governor?
Thank you, Pam. First off, just so I get this right, how many of you are from outside of Montana? Just raise your hands. Okay, I'm going to give you just a quick tour on Montana. We're a lot like the rest of the country in that you can use those cards that you've got, those little plastic cards. You can use them just about everywhere. And I would encourage you to spend a little extra time in Montana. Go north, go east, go west, go south. Look at some of our sites, spend a little money, and enjoy yourself a little beyond. And by the way, I'm sure when you get back home and you told them that you need to spend a little extra time in Montana, they'll be all right with that. Okay, so let's get that out of the way. As you know, I wear bolo ties, and today I'm wearing a bolo tie that's got pyrite on it. And this is pretty important because for those of you who have got some interest in the restoration economy, you'll know that 150 years ago when we discovered gold, silver, copper in the West, we started digging inside those mountains and dragging that ore out, but we really didn't understand pyrite. And so many of those metals are co-located with pyrite, fool's gold. And when you expose this pyrite to both water and oxygen, it creates a situation that the water that runs through it becomes very acidic. And the lower the pH of water is, the more it can contain these heavy metals. If you can keep the pH around 7, those heavy metals will stay inside the mountain. Unfortunately, we have cases all over the West where the miners didn't take a chemistry course before they got started. Now we are going to spend billions of dollars, with a B, all over the West in the restoration economy to try and clean up some of those mistakes in the past. So, it might have been 150 years ago you'd wear a bolo tie with gold on it or silver or maybe even copper. But hell, $1 billion worth of jobs, we kind of honor the pyrite now. So this is good business for the next 3 or 4 generations. Jag isn't here. Pam, you wouldn't have any way of knowing this, but Jag doesn't come to Missoula anymore. He goes everywhere else. He travels all over the country. He doesn't come to Missoula because he's got himself in some trouble here. You may not, pick this up yet, but in Missoula, they're a little bit snootier than the rest of the state. And one day, Jag was with me, and as you know, very well behaved, always right beside me. He was walking down the street with me, and somebody called him in to animal control, and because he wasn't on a leash. And so I got a warning that time. And then another time, we were over here, and he actually had a leash with me. We were going to the county fair, and we called ahead. Security had called to the security at the gate, and everything was cool. And so we get there, and they said, he can't come in here. Not allowed. And so that's 2. And Jag said, that's it. So now when I say to Jag in the morning, Well, we're off to Missoula. He just puts his paw over his eyes, puts his head down. So he really, and the mayor said, it's okay, Brian, you know, he doesn't have to have a leash. We got dispensations. But it's now it's become the principle for JAG. No Missoula. About 3-4 years ago, I was sitting down with my dad. He's now 87. He is the son of Montana homesteaders. And we're talking about things. And I say, Dad, what was the biggest change in your life when rural electrification came to the farm? He considered the question for a long time. You see, I'm half Irish and half German, so what I'm doing today is the Irish part. But the German part is you think a long time before you say anything. And so he thought about it, considered the question, and then he said, well, rural electrification was part of FDR's plan to bring electricity to every farm, every small town. And rural electrification was about connecting the poorest parts of this country to the richest parts of this country. And he said, so those rural cooperatives were formed, and they started stringing copper wires to places that they hadn't strung them before. And finally, he said, it was 1948 when we finally got the electricity in those copper wires from a coal-fired plant someplace else, and electrified the farm. But he said, now, the question was, what was the biggest change in my life? He thought about that for a while, and he said, well, it was that we could weld at a little hotter temperature. They'd had a wind charger on that farm since 1923. They had batteries in the basement. Hell, all of North Dakota and Montana and Iowa and Minnesota and Nebraska and Kansas and Colorado and Wyoming, farmers all over were clean, green, distributed power, batteries in the basement, producing their own electricity, maintaining those wind turbines and batteries with people who lived in their own communities. And now, in Washington, D.C., we have 535 of the brightest minds in America in Congress. Well, maybe not exactly the brightest, but some of the brightest minds in this country. And then about 10 or 20,000 lobbyists sort of working on how we get back to where we were 100 years ago. Wow. You know, when they got there, those homesteaders, they didn't have much to get started. So when they plowed their land, in Montana, of course, wheat was the crop. Old Jim Hill, he built that railroad from Minneapolis to Seattle, and the whole point of building that railroad was he was going to go out and get a bunch of immigrants from Europe, get them out there on that Homestead Act, get 320 acres of wheat, every one of those homesteaders, and then they'd deliver that wheat to his railroad, and he'd get rich. So, built the railroad, he went out and attracted these homesteaders, came from all over Europe, promised them that we got 40 inches of rainfall and you could grow tangerines in Montana, and they showed up in large numbers. But when they arrived, they didn't have stuff. What they had is high hopes, faith in God, and the ability to work hard. And so they would plow that sod, not fueled by petroleum. They had horsepower. It was actually horses. And they couldn't plant 320 acres of wheat because they needed to dedicate 20, 30, 40 acres to oats or some other crop. As that horsepower they grew on their own farm to feed the horses that was the horsepower to plow the crop, plant the crop, harvest the crop, and deliver the crop to the railroad. Now, 100 years later, 535 of the brightest minds sort of in America, 10,000 lobbyists are all talking about how can we be more sustainable? How can we produce our energy close to home? How can we choose the things that we can grow or blow or shine to produce the energy that we need at home and create jobs? Seems like a tall order. But we've been there before. We've managed to accomplish this before. Now, I was at a governor's conference, not Western governors, but I was at a governor's conference a few weeks ago, and we had a lot of energy CEOs there. Coal, oil, Canadian and American, transmission, utilities, some of the biggest utilities in America. And I said to them in this panel, you know how this goes, Pam, with these panels. I say to them, you know, a few years ago, I was the first governor in America to sign a document that said that we would produce 25% of our energy as renewable sources by the year 2025. So I said to them, is this doable? Can we actually achieve it? Or was I smoking pine cones that day? And they went around the table, all of them agreed that I must have been smoking pine cones. No chance, oil and gas and coal said, no chance we could get to 25% renewable by the year 2025. Well, their projections are somewhere around 2 or 3%. And they gave me the numbers of how little wind is and how solar will never get there financially. They explained to me that with these crops that we grow, you can't concentrate enough energy in a small enough place to produce a significant quantity of energy. And so maybe generations out, we will be able to produce this energy from renewable resources, but it's going to be a long time. Well, I hope they're wrong, and I'll bet you're hoping they're wrong. But it's not going to happen overnight. A few weeks ago, Secretary Salazar, was here, a friend of mine, and so he was in on a Sunday, and he was talking about the Restoration Act, how we're going to have money in the Recovery and Restoration Act to invest on the ground in the West in particular. Some of it's going to be used to clean up the mistakes in the past. Some of it's going to be used in our timberlands. And so I called ahead and said, look, would you like to take a helicopter ride first thing in the morning? So we did. We got in a helicopter that morning. Now, I don't know if you know how a Huey is configured, but in a Huey, it's a Vietnam-era gunship, but you've got 2 seats up front for the pilots, then you have 6 that are straight across, and then you have 2 that are facing the windows on the outside. And so we get in that Huey, and I'm going to take them up and show them a lot of red trees. Now, it's not redwoods. These are dead and dying trees, pine beetle kill. And that was important for the Secretary of Agriculture to see the magnitude. And so really within a 50-mile radius of Helena, you can see hundreds of thousands of acres of dead and dying trees. Those of you from Montana, you know what I'm talking about. And so we get on the helicopter and we get our headgear on and all the rest and get the doors closed. And I'm actually sitting at one of those 2 seats that are faced out. And then Secretary Salazar is sitting right next to me. And so we lift the helicopter up. And I say to Secretary Salazar, do you know what we call this seat here in Montana? He said, no. He said into his mic, well, what's that, Brian? I said, the wolf seat. And there was an uncomfortable sort of chuckle. Then later on the trip, after we had looked at some of the dams, including the first dams on the Missouri River system and thousands of acres of red trees and a few hundred head of elk, I said to him, Mr. Secretary, do you know what we say in Montana right after we shoot a wolf? He said, Brian, I really hate to ask what. I said, well, you're going to hear. We say in Montana right after we shoot a wolf, I think it was a coyote. Actually, I'm a big supporter of wolves. I ranched in the whitefish area for 20-some years. And some of you who are from Montana, you know that the wolves that we have in the whitefish area are native wolves that have actually moved down organically from British Columbia. And as near as I can tell, in 20 years, I didn't lose a single calf or yearling or anything else to the wolves. But I do believe that now that we have the numbers that have been prescribed, that the state's having the opportunity to manage wolves in much the same way as we've managed healthy populations of elk and deer and antelope and moose will be both beneficial for the resource, beneficial for the species, and also beneficial for those of us who make a living on the natural resource. Last week, I was actually in Regina, Saskatchewan, and I'd been invited there by Brad Wall, who is the equivalent of the Speaker of the House. They call him something else. He's the Premier. And of course, they have a parliamentary system there. They have a single house, I think 58 members, and they're elected from districts all over Saskatchewan. And then the party in charge, they get to choose who their speaker is, and they call him a premier. So that's their system. But he invited me up, and we were talking, of course, carbon sequestration. We have as they call it, project. We'd call it something else, but I kept hearing about this project. And this project is actually something that is needed. There are plenty of folks who talk about, well, gee, we need to change the way we produce our hydrocarbons. You know, over 100 years ago, it seemed like a pretty good idea to dig up or drill or some way get hydrocarbons. Those hydrocarbons were laid down 50 or 60 million years ago. They were simply plants that had captured energy and then had been covered over by an ocean, and that ocean created some sandstone or limestone or shale and buried them, put them under a lot of heat, a lot of temperature, and those hydrocarbons that were plant material, they became coal or oil or gas. And then, of course, during the last 100 years, we've been very successful at bringing them back to the surface. And when you disassociate the hydrogen from the carbon, we found that there's a burst of energy. And whether you're burning it as coal or gas or oil, you get that burst of energy, and then that carbon combines with oxygen, and you get a great deal of CO2. Now, it really wasn't a big deal until maybe 15, 20 years ago. There were some people on the cutting edge of this climate change that started suggesting that this could have significant influences. It's interesting because I know in the political spectrum, and there's some of all kinds in this room right now, in the political spectrum of people on climate change, there are people from all the way over here which say this is the greatest challenge that mankind has ever faced. This challenge of climate change due to carbon dioxide is a greater challenge than anything we've ever faced before, and we have got to move today. We should stop all coal-fired generators. We should park our cars. We should not use hydrocarbons, and we should immediately go to all renewable resources. That's this side of the spectrum. This side of the spectrum says it's all a bunch of hooey. You've heard it. Cows create more greenhouse gases than all of the CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere with hydrocarbons, or cockroaches. Oh, you hear that one too. But I think that there may be one or two of you on both sides of this spectrum, but almost all of us kind of fit the middle, which is to say, well, it is a contributor to climate change. We know that CO2 is one of the greenhouse gases. Methane is a big one, of course. And we are the folks who are producing the CO2. Have we created all the climate change? Well, probably not. Should we invest a great part of our resources right now to eliminate these greenhouse gases? I think the vast majority would say we should invest some resources and we should significantly decrease our greenhouse gas emissions in a period of time. So that's kind of where the middle ground is. And I know that we have people on both sides of this issue, but most of the scientists that around the world and most of the political leaders around the world, you'll find them, if this is a one over here that were to move into a cave and eat nuts, and this is the side over here that says, the hell with it, let's burn hydrocarbons until they're gone. If that's a 10 and this is a 1, I think most of us lie in that 3 to 6 area. And I think there's something that we can agree on. That if we are going to decrease CO2 emissions, the best place to start is where we're producing the CO2 emissions. Now some say, since we've already identified that it's coal, we should stop coal production right now. Yeah, we could do that, but we'd have to turn the lights off because it's 50% of the electricity that we currently use. And by the way, I'm a huge advocate for distributed storage around this country. I think in the next 20 years, we're likely to shift a great part of the cars and trucks that we drive to plug-in hybrids. And those plug-in hybrids will be able to buy electricity whenever the net unit price of electricity is low, and either be able to use that electricity to drive or to push electricity back into the grid when the price is a little bit higher. Well, if we're going to switch from petroleum to electricity as a driver of our automobiles in this country, it means we need a lot more electricity. So a bad place to start would be to eliminate 50% of the electricity that we currently have. So, as we move forward, we need to develop technologies that captures the CO2 from coal. Now, we know that we can do that pre-combustion. We can do this in a way that is in a pressurized chamber, integrated gas. But the problem is those existing stacks and this technology that we developed in this country that has been shipped all over the world, and now China is the leading producer of CO2. And they are not going to build the newest technology. They're not going to build coal-fired plants that cost twice as much as the current technology. They are building coal-fired plants that have smokestacks exactly the way we've produced CO2 for the last 100 years. And they are not going to put post-combustion capture devices on them because it costs a lot of money and is parasitic. They are not going to do any of those things until we develop the technology here. So let's get back to Saskatchewan. Our idea is this: Sask Power, which is really interesting. They only produce about 4,000 megawatts. About 2/3 of it is with coal. a relatively small utility compared to the utilities in North America. They have been working and spending money developing post-capture techniques. They actually have a plan to capture 100% of the CO2 from one of their existing coal-fired plants. These plans that we're working on right now would be around 30, maybe 40% and improve from there, capture the CO2, and then use it in geologic sequestration. Now, we all know about enhanced oil recovery. We know that CO2, in some cases, pumped into the geologic structures will actually increase oil production, and that's why CO2 has a value of about $25 or $30 a ton in the West. We will outrun the demand for CO2 for enhanced oil recovery once we start capturing just a few percent of the CO2 emissions in this country. So it's pretty clear that somebody has to take a lead in actually sequestering CO2 in a non-enhanced oil recovery application in saline water. So what we're working with Saskatchewan on is they will spend the money to capture the CO2. We will pipe it across the border and pump it into one of our saline formations and prove definitively for the entire world that this can be accomplished, or not. If we find that it costs too much, that the monitoring is inadequate, well, that's information we need to know too. But I'm impressed that this small utility, Sask Power, has actually taken a lead. When you compare them to somebody like the Southern Company or Duke or AEP or First Energy, where they're producing each of them 30, 40,000 megawatts of electricity with coal, and this little utility in Saskatchewan is actually taking a lead in investing in the future, I'm impressed with those folks. Now, I got there in time to actually watch their question session. I don't know if you've ever been sat in the chambers during a question session. I actually had the opportunity to do it in Ireland, which is, boy, you put the Irish to work at these question sessions. It's something else. But it's interesting in Saskatchewan where people are really nice, and they're nice to each other. And even the debate that would occur between politicos is always dialed back a great deal until you get to question session. Now, in question session, the two sides are placed facing each other. Those where their seats are, and they're exactly 2 sword lengths apart. Exactly. And the opposition, and it's interesting, in a parliamentary system, you legislators you'll like this, John. If you're in the minority, you just as well leave. You got nothing. They decide what's going to go on in a committee room with no press, and then they walk out on the floor, and they introduce the legislation, and they vote on it, and it becomes law. That's it. And so the opposition really doesn't even get to ask any questions until they get to the question period. And so theoretically, the question period ought to be a time where you could probe more deeply on some of those pieces of legislation. But instead, they just probe on each other. And it really is a shout fest. And they wear these little earpieces so they can actually hear the speaker, because there's so much background noise, shouting at each other back and forth and across. And I was told afterwards that you can have a question session or you can have guns, but you can't have both. So I guess since we've got guns, we're going to park the question session. Most important thing that we did accomplish is that we've demonstrated that we're going to work together. If we can agree that CO2 is a global problem, and it is, if we can agree that we have to find solutions to mitigate the production of CO2, and I think we can agree on that, then it makes sense for countries to work together, for provinces to work with states. We're all in this together. People say, well, Brian, actually, my best political ear is my mother. She's 80 years old, and she gets up in the morning and she reads the paper, and she knows I get up early. She gets up early. We're farmers. And she'll call me at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and she'll say, I was just reading about such and such that you did or the legislature did, and so she's kind of our own little question period. But when she read the first story about the possibility that Montana and Saskatchewan would work together, they would capture the CO2, we'd pipe it down to our side and store it, that we would create an international center of excellence to study carbon capture, both on the production side and on the sequestration side, that we would attract scientists from all over the world to deploy some of their new technology and to study our technologies. She read this stuff, and she said to me, what in the hell is the matter with you? How come Montana ought to take a bunch of poison from Canada and put it under our surface? And so, and look, she's pretty good here, because I think she kind of represents what a lot of folks in Montana are thinking. I think most people in Montana, if you were to give them a multiple choice test and ask them, describe to me what CO2 is and how it's formed when a hydrocarbon is burned, and what geologic sequestration is, I think most Montanans are pretty busy running their own business or teaching school or driving truck or running a farm, and they've heard about these things and they know it's important, but they're not exactly sure about it. And I think they kind of lay down where my mother was that day, which is, what the hell's the matter with you? Well, I said to her, here's what I responded. I say, Mom, look, there is a coal-fired plant just 12 miles north of the border in Saskatchewan. And right now, 100% of the CO2 that they produce goes right into the atmosphere, and some of it migrates over Montana, and some of it migrates over someplace else. But every single coal-fired plant on the planet is an emitter of CO2, and they all contribute to the overall problem. So it doesn't matter whether it's produced here or there, it's a global problem. Point one. Point two. So since it's a global problem, doesn't it make sense that we work on it together? And does it matter if we pump it below the surface 12 miles north of the border or 12 miles south of the border? I think what we know is that we have got to start, because every single journey, no matter how important the journey is, starts with a first step. And this is a first step. This will be a step that we can prove to the world that countries can work together, that we can capture CO2 and we can store it. And then as to being a poison, I said, Mom, when you take a deep breath, you're breathing in some nitrogen, some oxygen, a few other gases, and some CO2. When you exhale some gases, including CO2. It's a naturally occurring gas. It can be dangerous when it is in concentrations, but the good Lord, God, has stored pure CO2 in geologic structures for 50 million years under the Rocky Mountain West. If God can store it for 50 million years as pure CO2, if God can store that carbon in conjunction with hydrogen as hydrocarbons for 50 million years, wouldn't you think that we ought to be able to figure it out too? And my mom said, now I get it. Now, my challenge, our challenge, is for everybody's mom to get it, to understand what's going on here, to understand that we need to produce our energy in a different way, we need to consume our energy in a different way. It will create millions of new jobs, it'll create better energy independence, and incidentally, in the West, in addition to the little helicopter ride and talking about wolves, we talked a lot about biomass. I met with Secretary Vilsack, who is a very good friend of mine, the former governor of Iowa, and it was the first couple of days on the job for him. And I said, Tom, there has been no bigger advocate for grain-based ethanol on this planet than you as governor of Iowa. And it must make you very proud that you were there during step one of ethanol production and biofuel production, because now you are in charge of step two as the Secretary of Agriculture. You are in charge of the greatest supply of biomass in America to produce sustainable fuels or electricity. Whether we're gasifying it, whether we're producing a methanol or an ethanol, but these plants, these projects can be distributed, 20, 30, 40 megawatt or 20 million, 30 million gallon ethanol plants, so that they're distributed every place where we have dead and dying timber, so that we can create a sustainable timber harvest and create thousands of new jobs in the West. Maybe that grain-based ethanol was going a little bit in the wrong direction, but today we have an opportunity to transfer that technology and those ideas gained from grain-based ethanol to biomass-based ethanol. So here's our opportunity, here's our challenge. Welcome to Montana. Spend a little time, spend a little money, enjoy yourself. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Governor Schweitzer. That with those words, very encouraging words, to rouse us in our efforts here in the next day and a half. I think that the governor, of course, has been a passionate advocate for energy development nationwide, a spokesman in the country. And so we're very grateful that he would take the time out of his busy schedule to come and kick off this important workshop. We're going to go ahead and we've got a jam-packed day and a half here. And I'm not going to spend any time going through the full agenda here. You've got it in front of you. We're going to just get right into our first panel. We've got a very good panel here with Evan Barrett, Governor's Office of Economic Development Head and Chief Business Development Officer for the state of Montana, and cabinet officials from Governor Schweitzer's cabinet on our first panel to talk about bioenergy and how these cabinet or these agencies are going to be approaching this. So with that, and I would like to say in terms of thank yous, I did mention the staff of the Energy Promotion Development Office. I do want to thank Brian Spangler from the Department of Environmental Quality and also Angela Farr, if they're in the office, for all the hard work they did in putting this together.
Greetings. My name's Evan Barrett. I'm the Chief Business Officer in the Governor's Office of Economic Development. And when we talk about economic development in Montana, energy and renewable energy are a big part of the agenda. So, and because of that, so much of our, and by the way, I've got a little PowerPoint here to kind of amplify some of my opening remarks here. I want to give a little context to these fine members of the governor's cabinet who are going to let you know what's going on in their departments and how a state government sees this perspective on energy development, renewable energy development. So, but let me first, in terms of the context, say that that biomass energy development, what I'm going to try to do is illustrate what you kind of got a sense of in a really good way by listening to the governor, that it's part of a multifaceted approach to energy development. There's a lot of different ways to skin the energy cat, and it's incumbent upon those of us in America to find ways to do it. So the governor's energy, and I don't know how many of you can see that. I know in this corner you're probably shut off from that, but the governor's energy development vision is based upon the premise that if you look at that map, that we're part of what is the perhaps the most important energy corridor in the world. If you start up in the northern Alberta and Saskatchewan, where there's the tar sands, or now we call them the oil sands, you know, and work your way down through the Rocky Mountain West and all the way down into Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico, you're basically seeing all the forms of energy that are possible to develop in great concentrations in that corridor. This is perhaps the most important energy corridor in the world and one of the least developed in some ways. Now, it's all different forms, and so it's incumbent upon us to develop properly these resources, and that's part of the challenge we have. And within that context, and to do it right, when you look at it, Montana, sitting in the center of that corridor, we basically have virtually all forms of the energy that is available in the West. I mean, we talk about hydroelectric and geothermal and, wind, coal, oil and gas. Biomass is part of the mixture of what we have in Montana. We actually even have what we used to call oil shell. Now, we don't think we probably have it in the concentrations and how it can be properly developed, but who knows, later on we might. But basically, most of the forms of energy we have represent opportunities in our state. And so when the governor approaches energy development, we approach it on the basis of not just focusing strictly on the biomass and the geothermal and wind power, hydro. Those are renewables. There's some non-renewables in here, too, that need to continue to play a role, as the governor talked about. So we look at developing all of these, and the governor's carried on a dialogue with the people of Montana for the last 4 years so that the people of Montana understand this. And in fact, the people of Montana are wildly supportive of the broad range of energy development because it does present opportunities to solve some problems for the nation and the world, at the same time to create some economic activity. So let me just address how the perspective that the governor and his administration takes when they're dealing with energy development, and that's to run all energy development ideas through 3 filters. The first one is an international filter. Is what we are going to do going to be done in a manner that helps with global climate change? And that means taking things that are the enemy of global climate change and making them not the enemy, as well as finding alternatives like renewables. And nationally is what we're doing helping with our energy independence. And that's predominantly about liquid fuels. But remember what the governor said about the solution to the liquid fuel issue may be electrical hybrid cars, which means we've got to produce a lot more electricity to be able to do that, and we've got to create clean electricity in the process, which means, capturing CO2 and doing it right. And lastly, at the state level, the filter is, can we do it in a manner that creates economic development and growth, particularly in areas that have suffered from economic dislocation? There are places, we're the 4th largest state in the nation, there are places all over Montana that are out-migration, difficult economies, families moving away, nothing to sustain the economy in those areas where energy development can play that role. So we run all of our energy plans through these 3 filters. Does it help with global climate change? Does it help with energy independence? Does it help with economic growth? So what's been happening to energy development in Montana? Here's a couple of quick statistics. There's Montana oil production. Montana is the #1 percentage increase in oil production of any state in the nation. Most of the states you can see are having a decrease in oil production, and then a few states have growth. North Dakota and Montana have the most significant growth, and Montana has the highest percentage increase in growth. And if we understand what's happening with the Bakken out there in northeast Montana, the greatest potential for growth domestically is in Montana and North Dakota. When we look at coal production, this is the coal production chart from the 1950s right on through today. And you can see that come November, when the Signal Peak mine in Roundup comes online and gets to full production, we'll have a 35% increase since 2004 in coal production in Montana. Now, some of that's, in fact, virtually all of it's being shipped out of Montana, except some that goes into the coal-fired plants in Montana, and we ship out the energy from that. But by the way, the colors there, it isn't about politics, but it is worth noting that the rapid growth periods of development of coal came within what we would call the blue years, as opposed to the red years. Now, that isn't to say that D's develop more than ours. It's just but it does debunk a mythology out there that somehow, if you're a Democrat, you're against energy growth, because the truth of the matter is energy growth is occurring during those blue periods. But it's a big umbrella that has to support energy development. Whether you're a Democrat, an independent, or a Republican, you got to see the opportunity for development of energy as a way to get economic growth and solve big problems in this nation. Now, if you look here, this is the increase in electrical power production. Again, looking at the blue years and non-blue years, but you can kind of see big growth in the 70s and the 80s when coal-fired plants were coming online. 20 years of 14, 15, 16 years of very low growth with very little being added, and now, of course, a significant growth curve. But most of that now, Centennial is coal, Basin Creek is natural gas, Judith Gap, Horseshoe Bend, Glacier Wind, and Diamond Willow are all wind. Okay, and so there's more, and currently there's a lot of natural gas on the horizon. There's some coal, but coal gasification rather than coal burning on the horizon. So they're going to see a continued growth of electricity in this form. So the numbers do tell the tale. There's been aggressive growth. Now, energy, what's the potential? The potential in Montana is very strong. If you look here, we're the #1 state in wind power potential, class 3 and above. If you look at the darker the blue, the more potential for wind power development. And look at the circle around Montana, shows you in this nation where's the potential. The biggest potential is in Montana. That's a renewable source that has to be firmed, but nonetheless, it's a renewable source, and it's a number. And we've grown. We in the last 4 years went from essentially 1 megawatt to 270 megawatts, and we've had a 2,700% increase in those 4 years. And again, I'll show you where we're going in the future on this thing. Coal deposits. As you look at that coal, all different kinds, bituminous, subbituminous, and lignite, and even the oil shale is shown in that map. 28% of the nation's coal reserves are inside the boundaries of the state of Montana. And about 9% of the world's coal reserves are inside the boundaries of Montana. So it presents economic opportunities, so it behooves us to find ways to do it and do it right, as the governor spoke to, plus the economics of that. Here's a bit of a look at the biomass opportunities that deal with the red trees syndrome. You know, if you look at, we've got a whole area where all that stuff, its ultimate value is going to be being converted into some form of energy. Otherwise, it's just going to become what it is right now, which is a big problem. But the flip side of problem is opportunity, and Mary will talk about this quite a bit. Now, what's in the energy pipeline in Montana? Well, this represents the energy project since 2005. I won't go through them, but these are power plant activity, coal mine activity, biofuels activity, wind power activity, and so on. And there's a whole, and even a carbon sequestration project. That's the number one up above there. So what you see now is there's a lot of stuff going on. These are projects that are real. These are not hypothetical projects. These are real projects that are going on in Montana, and there's a lot more in the pipeline that will be coming out, because energy is a driving issue in the nation of the world today. And again, the premise here is we've got to do it, but do it right. The flip side of that is we've got to do it right, but do it. Okay? Now, here's an example in the wind. These are 50 wind power projects that our energy division has been working with, and those are scattered, you can see right along the Rocky Mountain front and through central Montana mostly, a little bit in the east. And there'll be more. There's a lot of wind opportunity in there if you look at that map. And that represents, those 50 projects represent over 4,000 megawatts of power. And that represents over $8 billion of investment in the wind farms themselves, which is an industrial tax base, by the way, to replace the old-fashioned industrial tax base with a new kind of industrial tax base, which is why we have to continue working in this vein. Now, when you produce power in Montana, electricity in Montana, you get deliver it to market. One of the challenges of energy development is that the energy is more developable where there are fewer people. So somehow, transmission lines and pipelines are part of the process. And this map just is symbolic of current pipeline activity and transmission line activity. The Mattel line, which is ready to go into construction, for the BPA upgrades that will come from the east with private lines as far as Townsend, and then on as a BPA upgrades. The Chinook high voltage direct current power line from TransCanada, 3,000 megawatts. The Misty project, which is a Northwestern Energy project, an AC power line with about 1,500 megawatts. If you look in the corner, if you can see it, those represent almost 6,000 megawatts of power moving in transmission lines out of Montana. We already serve ourselves well enough. People who say, just produce wind power for yourself. Well, the game's over. We already have more power than we need. We're already shipping a lot of power out. So this is opportunity for growth. The red ones are the pipelines. The two in the southeast corner are natural gas pipelines. The Enbridge is an oil pipeline that mostly in North Dakota upgrades that free up movement of oil from Montana. And then lastly, the Keystone XL, which is about a 36-inch. That's a $7 billion project, of which almost $1 billion is being spent in Montana to develop that 36-inch crude line, which will again make access to markets for us in Montana. So there's a lot of stuff being done, recognition that if we don't have the infrastructure to deliver the power, including the renewable power, then it isn't going to be developed. So again, we've got to do it and do it right, but that includes the modes of moving it. So the perspective of this thing is that as we talk about what all the departments are doing, we keep in mind that what we're doing with biomass energy development is part of a multifaceted approach to energy development. And Montana's approach to this in the Schweitzer administration is to develop energy in whatever form we can do it in, as long as we can find a way to do it right. Running through those three filters, is it good for global climate change? Is it good for energy independence, for energy security for America? And does it help with economic growth in Montana? So those are the things that we do. So that's why we work, and all these departments work every day to help the governor's agenda and Montana's agenda move forward in energy development. So let me just say now that give you a little bit of perspective of this, and I want to introduce one after another the members of the panel of the departments that are working a lot on on this broad range of energy development, and also specifically related to biomass. I want to just make a comment. Working at the governor's office level, and having worked at the governor's office level on and off since 1969, I hate to say that. But that we have a extraordinarily high-quality cabinet here. 4 of the 5 members of this cabinet have been with governors and the administration in their positions since the administration started, and have stayed and bring a lot of quality, expertise, stability, and vision to their operations. We are very, very proud of the quality of cabinet members that work in the Schweitzer administration, and it's really significant that you have 5 of them here to be able to address issues to you. So first I want to address and introduce the director of our Department of Environmental Quality, Richard Opper. Richard is going to talk a bit about the biofuels program they have there, and how they work with developing smaller development in the energy field, and of course we work very consistently on how to properly permit projects so they fit those 3 filters. So at this point, I'd like to introduce the Director of the Department of Environmental Quality, Richard Opper. Richard.
Thanks, Evan, and thanks to everybody for being here today. Appreciate that. We have a good turnout. It's actually great to be here with my fellow cabinet members. I got to tell you, we have a lot more cabinet members here than we do at our cabinet meetings. But, you know, in their defense, I think this is a lot more interesting meeting than a lot of our cabinet meetings. So anyway, it's good to be here with everybody. And again, thanks to everybody for being here. I appreciate it. So I'm just going to give a very brief overview, 4 or 5 minutes. I'm going to turn things over to the other panelists. We'll be around to answer some questions afterwards. Just to give you a little bit of background about me, though, I've actually been involved with the whole biofuels thing for years. I started at this about 30 years ago. I had this idea of converting this old sugar beet refinery, defunct sugar beet refinery in Hardin, Montana, into an alcohol fuel plant back in 1979, 1980. So I worked at that for a couple of years, unsuccessfully, as a lot of my endeavors have been. But I was interested in the subject matter for a very long time, and we've got staff, Brian Spangler, Howard Haynes here, who've been working on these issues as long as I have. They've been working on these, I think, since around 1982. So our department has a lot of experience in this field, and it's something we've taken seriously for a very, very long time. So I remember, this happened before most people in the audience were born, of course, but you know, the oil price shock we had back in the 1970s was pretty startling. It was the first time in generations that this country all of a sudden realized that it didn't control everything in the world. And all of a sudden, these gas prices started rising because oil started getting very expensive, and all these despots in other parts of the world we couldn't control anymore, and we were shocked to find that out because we thought we could control everything. So, you know, I'd have to say that thankfully we learned all the right lessons from that episode. You know, we learned to develop this economy that's based on, you know, sustainable, economically renewable sources of energy, so we're not vulnerable to increases in oil prices or, you know, things like that. Well, no, wait, we didn't actually learn that lesson. We learned how to build a Humvee. You know, boy, I wish we'd we'd learned the right lessons back then when we had a chance 30 years ago. And for those of us old enough to remember those days, seeing the kind of energy picture that we're in right now is kind of like Yogi said, it's deja vu all over again. You know, we've got another opportunity to learn some right lessons here, and boy, I hope we get it right this time, because, you know, if we had done the right things 30 years ago, we could have been energy independent by now. We really could have. We could have been immune from the fluctuations in oil prices right now that have such a profound effect on our economy. We could have prevented the release of billions and billions of tons of CO2 and other pollutants to the atmosphere if we had done things right now. And of course, my greatest fear is that as soon as energy prices start going down, and they're already starting to do that somewhat, we're going to get stupid again. And boy, I don't want to see that happen. So I think that's up to all of us to make sure that we learn the right lessons here. Just a couple of things about climate change. You'll be hearing from Dr. Running here. I would hope that most of you have already heard him speak before on this subject. You need to stay around to hear him. He's been very helpful to the department, to the state on this issue. But just a couple of things on climate change real quickly. I think you all have probably seen the graphs that show the comparison between atmospheric CO2 concentrations and global temperatures. And, you know, they only extend back for, 600,000, close to a million years, so it's not exactly a trend, you could say. Well, maybe it is. Anyway, these two graphs fit together like a key in a lock. They're so overtly linked that it's hard for anybody to deny that there's a link between atmospheric CO2 concentrations and temperatures. And if you looked at those graphs, you'll also notice that the atmospheric CO2 has kind of bounced around over the eons between about 200 and 300 parts per million in terms of concentration in the atmosphere. So the difference between 200 and 300 million parts per million is, well, it's 100 parts per million for those of you who are math challenged. But the difference translates to, I don't know, a few hundred feet of snowpack. Okay, it's a big deal. It's the difference between a day like today or an ice age. It's a pretty profound difference. So it usually takes about 5,000 years to go from, the changes happen pretty quickly. It takes, 5,000 years to go from 200 to 300 parts per million, that increase. It happens pretty quickly. Well, in my lifetime, and I don't accept all the blame for this, I'm only 50 years old, plus about 6 years, 56 years old, but who's counting? In my lifetime, it's gone from about 300, the top of that chart, to close to 400. So what that means is we're about 33% higher than we've been in the last 600,000 years or so. And if you're one of those people who believe that there's a link between CO2 and global temperatures, I think the technical term means, it translates to we're screwed. Am I talking over anybody's head here? So, even if you are a doubter about climate change, it sure seems to me this might be a good time to hedge our bets and see if we can do something to reduce our CO2 emissions. It's the safe way to go. So one of those tools that's available to all of us is replacing some of our fossil fuels with biomass. That will help some. That is a very viable tool. Now you couple that approach with the fact that we have this enormous volume of bug-killed trees in this state that you just heard about from Evan, and you'll hear about from other panelists. It means we've got a real opportunity here to do some things with this now, if we don't squander these opportunities. And so, we can either choose to manage these dead trees by wildfires, and wildfires are pretty destructive. It doesn't matter how much you work at reducing your CO2 emissions, all those savings will be wiped out in a few days by a wildfire. So we don't think that's the way to manage these bug-killed trees. So instead of managing them by wildfires, you can use these woody biomass materials in a more environmentally sound, energy-efficient manner. One of my colleagues, Mary Sexton here, is going to be talking about the Fuels for Schools program, where we use woody biomass to provide the heat and power to our school systems. I think that's a great idea. DEQ would love to see some of these wood-killed trees chipped and used as fuel in new, efficient wood-fired boilers now that are available and on the market. And we want to see that their use expanded greatly, and I think it's a great thing. One of the things that we did at the last count that we took, in just the forested regions, the valleys in western Montana, there are over 1,500 oil-fired, gas-fired boilers that are going to need to be replaced in the next 10 to 15 years. Now, doesn't it make sense to use these bug-killed trees for fueling new efficient boilers for those that need to be replaced over time? We think that's really the way to go here. So anyway, someday in the future, you heard the governor talk about this some, you heard Evan talk about it a little bit. We're also going to be using a lot of this woody biomass for transportation fuels. That's going to become an economically viable thing to do, and I'm looking forward to that day, and it's going to happen soon. So, and since you're using trees, you will be using trees to produce transportation fuel. This is waste cellulosic material. You'll get over that whole argument that us biofuel files hear all the time, that food versus fuel argument, because you're using wood wastes. You're not actually using food material. So I really look forward to the day that we can use a lot of this stuff for liquid transportation fuels too. So there are a lot of good things to do here. I'm going to wrap it up, and again, we'll be available for some questions. But again, I think it's our responsibility, everybody in this room's responsibility, to make sure that we as a state, we as a region, and we as a nation learn the right lessons from the energy picture that we're faced with now, and we don't make the same mistakes we made 30 years ago in thinking that this could go on forever. So again, I thank you for being here. I'm going to turn things over to my colleagues, and appreciate your time.
Let me just give you an additional thought here, too, that I had jotted down. That in the work that, as we've evolved on energy development, when the governor came in and had certain perspectives that were present 4 years ago, which have changed since. 4 years ago, everything about biomass was really about taking food grains and turning them into liquid fuel. And now biomass has become a much bigger picture. It's taking, finding many sources. The grains, yes, but grass, forest products, garbage, and turning it into not just liquid fuel, but into electrical fuel as well. So the whole concept of biomass has evolved rapidly in 4 years into a very multifaceted approach that was not this kind of a singular focused approach that exists before. And so in that, again, was opportunities for Montana, including the use of the forest products for biomass that can fuel a number of things, electricity as well as liquid fuels. So I'd like to introduce our Director of the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, who's been leading the charge in this state with help from a lot of people because of the threats to both the health of the forest and the dynamics of the forest products industry and the weakness of that doing new and better things with red trees and other biomass that's in the forest is a critical thing that we be moving on. So in that vein, I'd like to introduce our Director of Natural Resources and Conservation, Mary Sexton. Mary?
Good morning. Thank you, Evan. As I was driving over late last night from our home west of Choteau, I thought, actually what we do in our home where wood is the principal source of heat in our home west of Choteau is kind of what the department, DNRC, has been involved with. I live there in an area where there's a lot of limber pine. I don't know if you're familiar with limber pine. It's not really a commercial wood, but it certainly has been hit by disease over the last 5 to 10 years. In fact, the trees around my place are no longer red. They are dead. And so we have been around our house doing fuels reduction projects, had folks come in, and sometimes in the weekends I get a little exercise out there chopping down some limber pine, and we burn it. We have a pretty fuel-efficient stove. It's an older Vermont castings. I'm sure there are better ones now, but that is our primary source of heat. And why do we burn a lot of the wood around our house? Because there's a threat of fire. And it's been close to the door, within about a half a mile away, so I know the fewer trees I have around, the better protected my home's going to be, as well as getting heat from the fuel source that's around my home. In a sense, DNRC, which we are the Land, Water, and Fire Agency, management agency, we do have the responsibility for state and private forestry practices and management and oversight. And this is terrible. With my glasses, I can't see when it's way down there, so I have to bring it up in front of me. And we have seen two sort of alarming trends recently, and I shouldn't say recently, but they've been developing within the forest management arena. Again, we do this in state and private forestry. We have our own state trust lands, about 800,000 acres of state forested lands that we manage for the benefit of school children. But we've seen two trends, and one is the increase in wildland fire. I think that's not a surprise to anyone around Missoula, as you've seen the Black Cat fire from a couple years ago, as well as the Jocko Lakes fire. And the other is the increasing struggles of our wood products industry. And I think those things are really key, and they're very important points as we look to the opportunities and really the need for biomass energy production. And in DNRC, as we look at these two trends, which are coming together in a way that they really are crying out for better forest management, better forest health management, and added to that, of course, the red tree and the pine beetle problems that we're having, there really is a significant and important need for management of our forest, state, private, and federal. And I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about how we can do that to the benefit of all of us, for the health of our forests and for better biomass energy production. So yes, we have been involved in this in DNRC, and I think we are a leader. Angela Farr is here, who's been on our staff since 2005 and dedicated to biomass utilization. And I think one of the things we're most proud of is our Fuels for Schools program, which basically is doing on a much larger scale. What I've been doing around my house is utilizing those the resource that's out there, the woody biomass that's available, using very high intensive and very efficient fuels, boilers and so on for fuel production in the schools. And in fact, we do have 10 operating systems we're really a leader. We have 10 of the 15 operating systems in a 6-state area. We have 9 public schools and 1 university campus. If you go down to Western University, Western Montana, part of the University of Montana, they are all biofuel oriented there for their heating system. We save annually for these Fuels to Schools program about $730,000 in fuel costs. And this is offsetting, and I'm not going to give you a whole lot of numbers, but I think these really are important numbers for you. We're offsetting about 125,000 gallons of fuel oil. And this is again for our Fuels to Schools program, not just at Western, but across the state, including 9 public schools and the university. 40,000 gallons of propane are offset by the use of the biomass fuels, and 63 trillion BTUs of natural gas. So there really is a significant offset there, and I know if you need more of these specific facts that Angela would be glad to provide them for you. So I think that is where we have really been in a significant way involved directly with the biomass production and the opportunities for this utilization of biomass in the future. And I think one of the most hopeful things we see also is biomass utilization at our mills. Some of the mills, and you'll hear about this, already use biomass, but there's certainly a tremendous opportunity for many of our mills across the state as they struggle with the current economic conditions to use biomass and cogeneration as part of their mill operations. Another thing I want to bring up is that, and you'll hear more about it today, is that we have just recently funded a biomass report from the University of Montana. Todd Morgan, I believe, is here and is going to be talking to you about that. But in reading through this, there's one statistic that I wanted to share with you that I think is really fairly important. That right now we are producing approximately 2 to 3 million dry tons that are utilized for pellets, particle board, fiber board, liner board, and to generate heat and electricity. 2 to 3 million dry tons. And from this study, and you'll hear more about this later on, what is the approximate capacity that we have, given the forested lands that we have across Montana, to improve or increase this utilization of biomass materials? It's 40 million dry tons are physically accessible and suitable for utilization. So we're using 3 now, and we have the accessible ability to use up to 40 million tons. So there really is tremendous capacity out there that we really need to focus on, and that's a reason for our conference here today, is to discuss how we can do this. So as we as an agency have been working on biomass along with DEQ and the other agencies that we have here today from Montana State Government, working with our federal and private partners, the legislators have also been focusing on biomass and the opportunities there, biofuels. Just a couple things that I'd like to mention in closing would be that there was a biomass study, House Joint 1, by Julie French out in eastern Montana, and her primary concern is that we have a lot of programs across the state and we're not all talking to each other, whether we're at the private level, the university level, the state level, the federal level. So the objective of the House Joint Resolution 1 of biomass study is to bring these programs together and have opportunities for them to better interact and collaborate with each other. Other bills include the increase of the nameplate capacity for renewable energy production up to 25 megawatts, and that would be very helpful for biomass utilization. There's also funding within our stimulus package, the ARRA package of about $500,000 for biomass projects. And there was another piece of legislation which improves which addresses the property tax categorization for renewable fuels such as biomass, which will be helpful and beneficial in the long run. So there's a lot of opportunity out there. There's certainly a significant amount of need. I think that we can't overestimate the red trees that are out there and what they mean not only for our forest health, but what an opportunity it is for us to increase our woody biomass production. So you'll have an interesting conference here, and I know there's lots that my other colleagues have to add. So thank you for your time, and I'll turn it over to the next one.
You say we're running a little over, but what do you expect when you get 6 people up here, who have a lot to say and a lot to offer? We'll try to get through this rapidly enough to not get too far off schedule. I want to say that everyone here on the panel will be available lobby time for Q&A on anything they're talking about, any programs that you think might have applicability to you. Grab them, talk to them while they're here, okay? The next person I want to introduce is head of our Department of Agriculture, Ron DeYoung. He's going to be talking a lot about biodiesel, about cellulosic ethanol in some vein, use of cellulosic, about algae. He brings a unique set of skills and experience to the position of Ag Department Director. He's been both a professor and a producer. So he comes from both sides of the equation here to bring things together to try to make agriculture more productive for Montana's economy and in interesting and new ways. So with that, I'd like to introduce Department Director Ron DeYoung. Ron?
Good morning, and thanks for the chance to be on the panel. So let's talk about biodiesel for a little bit here. We've got 4 oil crops in Montana. We can raise camelina, canola, safflower, sunflowers. Now you can get a variety of products from each one of those. And it's real important to look at all the products that you're going to get from those. When you crush that oil seed, about 30% of it comes out as oil. And you can get biodiesel out of that, or you can get biolubricants. You might actually get biodegradable plastic, different kinds of products. Now it's important because we all want cheap energy. And so we're going to have to get to the point where energy is the byproduct, not the main product, but the byproduct. And you actually are getting the margins on these other products. Now, 70% of it comes out as meal, roughly, on all these. So that's high protein feed for livestock. And then MSU, like on the camelina, is coming up with a variety of really innovative products to use that meal in other ways. But the one byproduct, or the one product that we forget about lots of times, is the rotation. How these crops fit into a rotation is a significant product that you were going to come up with. Now here in Montana, the money crops are wheat and malting barley. So you want to tend to raise the money crops as much as you can so you can actually survive out there on the farm. But if you continue to raise the wheat and the malting barley, you end up with getting in this a little bit of a treadmill where you're going to have to use more chemicals because you're not breaking that disease and pest cycle. You're going to have to use more fertilizer because you're not having those kind of rotational crops. So what we really need to do is raise those money crops, say, 1 out of every 3 years. Then you need to raise a legume crop like peas and lentils one set of years there, so you actually put some nitrogen back into the ground. And you need to actually change that system around where you have to send a taproot down with one of those oil crops, one of the brassicas. Now, in Montana, in a lot of our rotations, we keep land out of production 1 year, either with mechanical tillage or chemfoul, just to build up enough moisture for the money crops the following year. If we can come up with an oil crop that actually fits into the rotation that replaces part of that idle time, and the one that I'm going to talk about is camelina because of the potential that camelina has to do that, well, that would be something that's replacing just idle land, and we could actually get something off of it. So, camelina. It's really important because it has fewer inputs than the other crops we just talked about. Now, we're raising the other 3 crops, and we're using most of it for food-grade oil, cooking oil, on those other crops. Camelina doesn't take much fertilizer. You can raise it without any fertilizer, but a little bit of fertilizer will improve the yield. It doesn't take much water, which is extremely important if you're actually going to use it in that rotation where your whole goal that 1 year is to collect enough water for the money crop the next year. It doesn't take very much money to actually put the seed in the ground. The seed is inexpensive. Chemicals, we've got one chemical right now that we can use on grassy weeds for it, and it's called Post. It's one of the more benign chemicals, so we can take grassy weeds out of the crop. You can seed it very early in the spring. So it gets a real early start. You could actually be harvesting that camelina, say, July, which means you still got a good chunk of the year to collect moisture. And if you collect enough moisture there after the camelina crop comes off, you can put winter wheat in the fall. If you don't collect enough moisture, well, then you're going to have to collect moisture over the winter, and you can put spring wheat in the following year. So that's one of the biggest byproducts when you got to look at these crops is how they're going to fit into a rotation, in the state of Montana or in the Great American West. Okay, that's a little bit about biodiesel, just to give you some of the opportunity we have there. And I just wanted to briefly touch on cellulosic ethanol. We're moving from the grains to the cellulosic. So we're doing a little bit of research here in Montana down in MSU, and we're coming up with a barley straw that has high levels of fructan in it, which is easily converted to fructose. And if we're talking about when you're talking about making ethanol, if you're getting close to making, you got a sugar crop like sugarcane, you can do that a little easier. Well, we're finding out some barley straws are much, much higher in this fructan. And so you can convert it to fructose a lot easier. So we can actually start raising straw in the barley that actually we could use for cellulosic ethanol. We're also finding that there's certain barley straws that are very high in protein that we hadn't really noticed before. So for animal feed, just from the stock. So we can look at different ways we can actually make the cellulosic ethanol work in Montana. The third area I just wanted to touch upon so you can think a little bit for asking questions later is algae. In Western Montana, we've got some hot springs in Montana, and we've got this innovative endeavor that's starting out in hot springs, and we're going to see where this takes us, where they've got hot springs there. Now, in order to get energy straight from the hot springs, you have to have a temperature of above 120 degrees. You got to have a really hot springs in order to generate energy out of that. We've got a lot of low-grade thermal energy in Montana. So what they're doing in hot springs is they're going to use that low-grade thermal energy to grow algae. And when you see the hot springs just running down the streams there in Hot Springs, Montana, the algae is already growing there. So you can do this easily. So we're looking at a project where you can grow the algae in a greenhouse, use the energy created by the algae and so forth to heat the greenhouse, so you can actually raise whatever you want in the greenhouse besides doing the algae. You can take the algae, run it through a biodigester, and get methane out of it, and then the methane can be converted into electricity. Everything that's produced, all the carbon dioxide that comes out of that digester, can go back into the algae as a food source for the algae to actually stimulate the growth of the algae. So we're looking to see, putting a complete system together on the algae to see how that will all work. So those are the three areas in agriculture that we're looking at. We, in the department, we have growth through agriculture grants where we provide seed money for startup projects to do that sort of thing. We have food and ag centers where if you need to go and get a business plan, you can go get a business plan, a marketing plan. That's all provided for free. We encourage people to do that before they come and get the seed money, because generally we only award grants for about half the applications because competition's that tough. So we want you to have a good business plan when you put that together. And those are the areas we think have potential in Montana. Thanks.
Thank you, Ron. I would mention there's some, it's like church, there's the front pew is open over here, but I have to comment that we're just about standing room only here, and it's really good to see such a great turnout. The next person on the schedule is Tony Preeter, Director of the Department of Commerce. Tony's returning from a visit with his grandchildren over the weekend, and so Deputy Director Andy Poole is here to discuss the Energy Development and Promotion Division, Tom's division, which is something we added to the state governmental structure in the Department of Commerce, and how they help with developing energy in a business development sense. And so our strongest partner from our perspective in economic development in terms of programs that make economic development work is the Department of Commerce. And I'd like to welcome Deputy Director Andy Poole. Andy.
Thanks, Evan. Before I get going, I'd like to take just a minute and recognize the work that Evan Barrett has done over the last 5 years. I don't think many people in this room realize how much dedication he has put toward this effort of energy development in the state. In addition to Evan, I'd also like to mention the work that, or at least acknowledge the work that Tom Kazurski and Chantel McCormick, Linda Pelagi, and Sarah Desmond from our office have contributed to the state of Montana in energy development. So if you would, please, this may not be the only occasion, but let's give them a round of applause very quickly. Thank you very much. I want to talk about the Department of Commerce very briefly. You know, the mission of the Department of Commerce is really twofold, and that is to work with private businesses to create quality jobs in Montana. And that's something that we work at every day, and also to work with our Montana communities to develop their facilities, their housing, and their essential infrastructure. So really it's economic development and community development. The Energy Promotion Division was created in 2007 at the request of Governor Schweitzer and with the close work of the legislature. And the purpose of the division is really threefold. It's to facilitate and advance energy projects of all kinds throughout Montana. It's to help implement the governor's and the legislature's green energy development in Montana, and also to facilitate processes related to permitting, siting, workforce, and financial assistance. The division is the front line for state support of energy development in Montana. The staff are ready to assist in all aspects of potential energy projects around the state, and staff work directly with the Governor's Office of Economic Development, and other state agencies on energy issues. So the division has been critical in the state of Montana in bringing these projects to where they are now. I was going to talk a little bit about wind energy and transmission energy and where some of the projects are right now, but Evan covered that in his overview, so I won't go into that. I do want to talk a little bit about the Department of Commerce and some of the programs that we have. We're really, and I mentioned earlier, an economic development agency. And we have some tools that can be used by companies who are looking to develop bioenergy projects throughout the state. We've got feasibility study funds that are available through the Department of Commerce. A couple of programs can do that. The Big Sky Economic Development Trust Fund and also the Community Development Block Grant Program have funds for feasibility studies for bioenergy development. Not a significant amount of money for any one project, but as Mary mentioned a little while ago, there may be some money in House Bill 645 for feasibility studies for biomass projects, provided what happens with 645 when the governor signs it. We also have funding for grants for workforce training, the New Worker Training Grant Program. It was modified during the legislature so that it can address not just new workers, but also existing workers in the state of Montana. That's a great program for any company that's growing and creating jobs in primary sector businesses in the state. We also have the Big Sky Economic Development Trust Fund that can provide funding for new workers, and that is limited to new workers in primary sector companies. You can get up to $5,000 for each new job created. The jobs that are created through that program have to have a minimum wage, and they have to be full-time employment, but it is another good opportunity to get financing for bioenergy projects in the state of Montana, and that funding can be used not just for worker training, but also for things like working capital, for inventory, for workforce training, for interest rate buy-downs, a number of other things. And finally, I'd like to mention that the Board of Investments has a number of loan programs and low-interest loan programs that are available to companies in Montana that are creating new jobs for new workers and primary sector companies. You can get debt financing as low as 2% for a 5-year period, and it ratchets up a bit, but depending upon the number of jobs you're creating, through a couple of programs that they have, you can get very low interest financing. And combined with the resources that we have in the Department of Commerce that I just mentioned in terms of feasibility studies, grants for new worker training, grants for other kinds of things through the Big Sky Economic Development Trust Fund, and then finally from local and regional development organizations that have their own funding, it's possible working with the private sector, and I don't want to leave them out because all of this is driven by the private sector. The business people who risk their own finances and get debt and other resources from other people, and also by the private banking sector. There's hardly a project we ever do. In fact, I can't remember a project we've done that doesn't have bank participation in the project. So the private sector is critical, in fact essential, to doing any of this. And so we're a support mechanism to the private sector to make sure this gets done in Montana. And bioenergy is certainly probably the top priority for the state right now as it relates to a lot of things, but also as it relates to economic development. So thank you very much, and we'll be available for questions.
The next and final member of the panel is Keith Kelly, the Director of the Department of Labor and Industry. I've known Keith longer than anyone up here on the panel. He and I graduated from the same high school in the same year. We're part of what we call the Carbon County Mafia in the state government. Keith and myself came from Red Lodge, and Patty Keebler, who was here with the governor earlier, comes from Roberts, and Christian McKay, who's the head of the Department of Labor or Livestock, is from Roscoe. And so we have a little Carbon County thing going up here, and we hope it adds to the quality of things. But when we talk about one of the challenges for our office is to do workforce development. And when you think about bioenergy, and you think about plants and development of this, there is a workforce challenge because often where, at a time when there's a recession going on, it's hard to realize that our unemployment is still 2.5% or better lower than the national unemployment rate. And we still have the challenge of available workforce that's properly trained in the areas where fuel development and energy development, including biomass development, can occur. And that's the purview, at least substantially the purview, some of the Department of Commerce and job training, but there's a big part of it that's in the Department of Labor and Industry. And that's the issue to which we count on Keith to help us with workforce development. Keith Kelly.
Thank you, Evan. Speak for yourself. I was more on the Elliott Nuss side. You were on the Mafia side, if I recall right back in them days. But anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to sit here and visit with you, and I want to acknowledge, I don't know if many know that, there's a lady that got the toughest job here flipping the flip charts over, so I will stick with my 6 minutes and get right into it as fast as we can. Announced last week, 8.9% unemployment nationwide. That went up from 8.1. That was an 0.8 jump. The economists are looking, we're all trying to figure out where we're going to land in this. However, Montana is at 6.1 to date, but in 10 days we will release the figures. that will correlate with the 8.9%. It does appear to me we've gone into this recession significantly different than other periods of time. And so with that, Montana was very well, if there is such a thing, very well positioned going into the recession. And what I want to get out of this whole deal and leave with you is really just to kind of wrap up what several of the other speakers have said. Hopefully, Richard, by our age, I hope we have learned the lesson in 1972, as I certainly ran when we went up to, I think, $2 a gallon of gasoline, and we thought that was the end of the world, and we saw ourselves get very complacent very quickly. Hopefully, this time we've learned our lesson and to say, boy, we better put our shoulder to the wheel and get with it. I'm going to just relate three things within the Department of Labor and Industry that are trying to address this in a broad variety of ways. You will hear much more detail. I think Adam DeYoung is tomorrow on a panel there with much more time here to get down in the weeds on the WIRED, Workforce Innovation and Regional Economic Development. That's what WIRED stands for, and what it was really tied up to do was to sit here and do a better job in this country of aligning the employment piece with the education piece with the economic development piece. And so I've worked very closely with Ron DeYoung in the Department of Agriculture, and with Tony Preedy, Andy Poole here with the Department of Commerce, as well as K through 12 and higher educations to better align the workforce for these jobs for the future. We all know that Governor Schweitzer's been a real advocate out there with regards to where Montana can fit into the energy picture. And that's a constantly changing thing as we're going forward. You've witnessed the slides that Evan showed there earlier with what progress we've made, but what a whole heck of a lot more work needs to be done on that. So with the WIRED philosophy, Workforce, Innovation, and Regional Economic Development, we did that in eastern Montana, 32, 33 counties, and we use as our platform on biomass-based fuel products out there. And one of the reasons is, as you can see what Ron talks about, when you get yourself in eastern Montana, there are not a lot of other options other than agriculture, and we've witnessed a 20% decline in many of those communities in the last since 1980, basically, from Lewistown, Miles City, Glasgow, pick your community, and there's been significant decline. So what other alternatives and options for these struggling communities can one to sit there and sustain the workforce and the base out there? One of them is to find another alternative to production agriculture, which Ron went into in quite a detail. And so that coordinated effort is still underway. We probably have to get into the K through 12 aspect of that to get really down into help these kids in school look at career paths. These are very good career opportunities in this whole energy sector. And you heard the governor's opening comments on here for the next 20 or 30 years. I suspect we're going to see tremendous amounts of focus on that as we go forward. What that did then is morphed into, and I see Dick King sitting over there, and I hope he can remember, we did evolve on the west side then, since we did that on the east side. That was a $15 million for over a 3-year period, of which only 7 states in the nation got. So on the west side, we did come back with a RIG grant, and I think there's 11 counties in the RIG area, and that's regional innovation grants, which is really, as we're trying to take it a step further with the local economic developers, with the education community, and again, to sit here and put in place to train people for the future jobs over here. And a lot of this money, I think 3 communities, one here in Missoula, one in Thompson Falls, Dick, and I think the other in Polson, received small sub-grants to go out there and do some planning and coordination meetings together, of which we're going to report to in June up at a governor's symposium in Kalispell in the early part of June on some other alternatives or some value-added things that can be added to it. So it's really just a chance to put it down at the local level, at your level, to sit there and see what makes sense as we kind of go forward with this. And I suspect a lot of the ideas that Mary talked about today, especially as we all look at the red force out here, how can we capture that and do something with that? That really led into the last one, and I'm down to 2 minutes, right on target. So the 21st Century Workforce Bureau, we've done a reorganization in the Department of Labor and Industry to really sustain and implement that WIRED philosophy and align our apprenticeship programs. Those are good paying jobs that we have here in Montana. A lot of these apprenticeshipable skills in that. The State Workforce Investment Board is a part of that. Jobs for Montana Graduates is for disadvantaged youth and children, and especially on a lot of our Indian reservations. And again, I mentioned the wired philosophy. And I really want to finish up with the stimulus dollars and the green collar economy that I see, at least in the short term, we can really capture into and pick up what I would call some low-picking fruit. As you know, Governor Schweitzer promoted two in the legislature. Mr. Appropriator, I see him sitting over there, provided by quite a bit of money, 20 by 10 initiative to weatherize their public buildings. That's probably what President Obama did, the same thing on the federal buildings. There's $27 or $28 million there in that pot of money. There's another $23 million of money in energy assistance for low-income housing. That does not include the HUD piece out there, which is working on that, as well as the Native American money. So if you tally all that up, we're looking at close to $100 million on basic weatherization kind of issues out there. And President Obama is really putting emphasis on the green collar economy as he selected as his Secretary of Labor, Ms. Solis, that she was the author of the green collar jobs and economy out there. So here we have an opportunity, at least in the short term, to put some things in place for up to $100 million in investments on just putting in the insulation on the storm doors so we're not sending things up the chimney. And so with that, that's a sustainable economy that anytime you can move and not spending a unit of something for energy and conserve the energy, there's a real payback to that going down the long haul. Now, I know that's a short-term thing in there. Now we got to get to the cliff, stimulus package ends. Do we have it sustainable to go on forward? And that will really be the challenge out there. And so with that, whether it's, Evan showed the transmission lines, the power lines, the welders, the pipe fitters, the plumbers, think of all the skills and the jobs are out here as we can evolve Montana's economy and keep Montana put back to work, especially in some of these communities that really struggled around here. And we're going to come out of this recession. We just went into it probably better than most other parts of the country. And with that, I'm looking at seeing that this $500 million is still sitting out there waiting to be developed. There are rules and regulations and the guidelines on that within the stimulus package of the U.S. Department of Labor to look at more of the training and assistance for this type of green-collared economy out there. And green jobs, to me, it just really talks about American energy, sustainable. You can use whatever nomenclature you want. They really tend to fit together, and we do have a convergence, it seems to me, to get where we all need to go. And my half minute's over. She's turned it on its side, so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Now, that's the end of this panel. Now, we ran a little bit long, but let me just say that it is unique that you have 5 cabinet members available, and so take advantage of that during the coffee breaks and so on to grab them, ask your questions, find out what's going on, see how you can fit in, because they're the people that are delivering through their departments the governor's commitment to a broad range of energy development, including in biomass. With that, thank you very much for your attention. Let's give them a hand.
Thank you very much, Evan and panelists. We'll continue to move right along. Our next session involves Alex Schroeder with the Western Governors Association, runs their nuclear and transportation fuels program. I'm going to let Alex go ahead and introduce his guest to talk about the bioenergy assessment. Alex?
Thank you very much, Tom, and I promise not to talk about nuclear. This is really an exciting time, I think, to be working on these issues. Our panelists have very eloquently laid out some of the challenges we face, and I think that also presents a lot of opportunities. And so I'm going to be very brief in my remarks, but I wanted to provide some context because I know Ed Gray has a great presentation for you all. The Western governors for quite a few years now have been working together on energy issues, realizing that there really are a lot of regional synergies and a lot of opportunities, I think, where they have there is a benefit in collaborating with each other. So in 2004, the governors set a goal for renewable energy development in the region of 30,000 megawatts by 2015, and at the time that was very ambitious. We put together task forces to kind of look at the different technologies, wind, solar, biomass, and make recommendations back to the governors on how they can get to that number. Ed Gray, coincidentally enough, was a co-chair of our biomass task force and has been working with us ever since. And really the next step for us, after we kind of looked at the electricity side, was to look at transportation fuels. And biomass is unique because it has multiple uses, and I think that's something we're going to be confronting in the future as well, as you've got competing uses for biomass, whether it's a higher value product with electricity, with fuels. We're going to have to start to consider that. So we looked at the fuels piece and really did this kind of strategic supply chain assessment, and that's what Ed's going to be talking about today, to come up with what a reachable and quantifiable goal is for biofuels production in the West. So just to provide a little background on Ed, Ed is the owner and president of Antares Group. It's a consulting engineering firm specializing in advanced energy technologies for industry, power production, and transportation. As I mentioned before, Ed was also a co-chair of our Biomass Power Supply Working Group and is one of our project principals on our Western and National Bioenergy Assessment. So, Ed.
Thanks, Alex. First, I want to apologize. I came to Montana with the remnants of a sinus cold and a little bit of a cough, so I've got my water handy. But I want you to know I'm on 2 really strong drugs. I'm on a clarithromycin, which is a good antibiotic, and the second one is crisp, clean Montana air. So I want to take a poll. Which one of you thinks the antibiotic's going to cure me first? How about the Montana air? I'm with you. I've seen it happen before. Clean air is a value that you cannot measure for most of us. And most of us who have grandchildren and families really look forward to them having the same experience we had, living in a place where air is clean, water's clean, the recreational values we treasure are there for them. So one of the real keys to our work in the assessment here is to understand if biomass can help that equation. Can we mine this vast resource in the country and keep it sustainable and keep our air clean and maybe even improve our air quality? And one of the real interesting things about biomass, if it's used in the right way and produced in the right way, it can have a very positive effect on the environment. So if we mine it that way and we work it that way, we end up with a big net benefit. And when we were talking about that CO2 sequestration project that Montana's involved in, that's great for coal. What does it do for biomass? We like to call biomass a net zero CO2 emitter. There's a lot of controversy about that. Under the right conditions, I think that holds up. You have carbon capture and sequestration. You're now a net sink. And we did some work for EPRI looking at how that could contribute to the utilities, tools and weapons to use in the future here to deal with carbon constraints in a carbon-constrained economy. And suddenly biomass becomes a carbon sink. That's a very powerful tool for the utilities to use to meet their goals. But that's a technology that's got quite a ways to go, and I'm glad to see Montana's going to be the first to show us how to do it. Do I have some pictures to go with it? Do I have control here? No. Is it right here? This doesn't look like my home control unit. Which one? Okay, that's the last slide. Was it the first? Just click it.
No, scroll it up or down.
Oh. Okay, this was a whole lot trickier. I think Alex already mentioned all the work WGA has done to take a look at how biomass can be used in the entire West productively and how it can meet goals for renewable energy development as part of the entire picture. Got a lot of wind resources in the West, got a lot of solar for that matter, but biomass is going to be a key element no matter how you cut it in almost every state. Some of you are much richer than others in biomass, and we're trying to find out where exactly the best resources are and what technologies fit. So here's the conundrum. Whenever we do this work, we get asked to first tell us how much electricity we could produce if you got all the biomass. And those of us who worked on the task force said, no, that's not the way biomass works. Biomass is a multifaceted resource. It produces products already, it can be used to produce fuels, and it can produce electricity. And if you really want the answers to the question, you have to look at all of those at the same time. Way too complicated for most folks to adjust to on the policy side. So typically, we get asked the question, how much can we do if we get all the electricity from biomass? And now we were asked the question, suppose it goes to biofuels. How would it be used? How much could we produce in the West? And what technologies would we use to bring it to bear on Western resources? So the goal was to develop a biomass supply chain optimization model for the entire Western United States and provide a projection for the role that biofuels could play in the West by 2015. Project components, biomass resources, we tried to map and understand as fully as possible what were the resources, ag, forestry, and waste resources that we could mine to produce biofuels with. So we put a lot of effort into just understanding where those resources on a county by county basis throughout the entire West. Biofuel conversion technologies. I think you're probably pretty aware that even in these tough times, there's a fair amount of investment going on in bioenergy technologies, and particularly in the biofuels arena. It's fascinating to watch the public money that's going on there. The one thing I've learned is what you first need to do is build an IT business, make yourself wealthy enough, and then you can finance a biomass project with it. And range fuels, the number of companies that are involved now is just amazing, and it's really a good sign. It's a very healthy sign for the U.S. to see all this investment going in options and choices among these technologies, because it's not clear that one is going to be a winner above the others. And that's probably good. Diversity in energy production is probably going to be the keynote for our future, not single-minded, one-shot solutions. So we started off with, I think, 12 technologies we characterized: performance, cost, what you could do if you had to build it, what would it cost, and what could it produce, what kind of yields could you get by different types of feedstocks. Then the tricky part, when we did the power study, we just said, let's assume all the resources are in the center of the county, and to build a power plant that, near there, and just take those resources and just use an average mileage to get you to your resource to your power plant. And then the folks at UCD, my partners, let me mention them. There's Richard Nelson on the ag side, and he's also accumulating all the data for forestry with the help of Ken Skog from the Forest Service. Ken is doing a terrific job of telling us how much woody biomass resources there might be out there. And then at University of California, Davis, it's about 3 young grad students who came up with the idea with Brian Jenkins that, hey, Ed, we can do better than just put all the resources in the middle of the county and use an average distance to get to the plant. We're going to use some of this GIS capability we've got, and we're going to literally use some optimization models to figure out where's the best place to site the plant, and then what does it really take using the road systems and infrastructure to get the resources from the field to that plant. And then we're going to either get it in the pipeline or we're going to get it on a truck, and we're going to map it to the nearest distribution terminal. And when they told me they were going to do that at the beginning, I said, we'll never get it done. We don't have enough time to do a GIS analysis for the entire West. And those guys proved me wrong. Those young grad students managed to pull it off. And in a year's time, we were able to map GIS and put an optimization model together that picked the sites and move biomass from the field to the plant, from the plant to the distribution terminal, and a very realistic picture of how the bioenergy industry could develop. It was really fascinating and fun to watch these guys work. I think they're a little worn out now, but now their new challenge is to do it for the entire U.S. So I hope they get their energies back. Whoops, wrong way. So, at the end of our study for the Western governors, and by the way, you really have a wonderful organization in the WGA. When I went out there to work with a team of experts in biomass who were going to put together the study for power, I've never worked with such an amicable team of people in problem solving, trying to use the best resources they could to come up with these answers and work. And WGA really structured it so they got great talent to work on the project and provide the inputs needed to do it in a very smart way. And the same has happened on this biofuels research. So we believe by 2015, the West has the opportunity to produce 11 billion gallons of biodiesel and biofuels. A fourfold increase from where you are now. You have the potential there. You have the technologies that are going to be coming online. We think by, say, 2015, they're in the demonstration phase, and we will see progress on those. And if they do play out, and if we can get our finances back together, we could achieve this in the West. And from a variety of resources, including herbaceous energy crops. So we put together two curves. You can get to the 11 billion gallons per year potential. That would include about 44,000 million gallons of corn ethanol, which is largely your base in place, plus some growth that was already planned. But we see the majority increase coming from the lignocellulosic biofuel stream. That's a huge growth amount from them, 6,700. That curve that goes up there sharply is only going to happen if government, industry really collaborate hard and put the resources to work. That is a fast deployment schedule. So for realism, which is part of my job on the panel, is to keep things real. We put in a curve that says, hey, let's see if we couldn't get to the 7 million mark. That seems reasonable, just looking at the number of plants you would have to build by the time they're actually available and have demonstrated their capability, assuming you can get the financing. And then the nice thing about the UCD work is that you end up with these really cool maps where you can just see where the resources are that you're pulling into these plants, where the plants could be located, and what the capacity of those plants are by type, whether they're producing a middle distillate or they're producing ethanol or what type of biofuel or biodiesel they're producing. So it's a really neat outcome is to just be able to look at these maps and look at those resources. And the key there is to see if we can't take this to the entire US. That was our supply curve. Well, that's a Montana biomass supply curve. It's probably hard to read from here, but it certainly says forest resources, at least in this first take, are your primary resources to mine. There you have by and large, that is your resource to put to work. So from that message, you would be looking at technologies that really put that feedstock hard to work for you, if you want to do it locally here. And then we located two plants for you. I think one's in Billings and is one in Missoula. I can't actually read that myself. But on looking at it in the West, we could see at least two full capacity biofuels plants being operated in Montana. They wouldn't necessarily end up in those sites, but those are realistic places where we could bring the resources in, we think, to build good capacity plants to produce biofuels in Montana. So you certainly have the capability. So we're implementing a national model now. We're going to build on the WGA models. We're going to build in some greater capability in these, and we'll show you. Here's the resource data sets we have. Now, of the two resource data sets, bioenergy resources, which include agricultural crops, tallow, grease, orchard, forest thinnings, energy crops, corn, and select oil seeds, municipal solid waste. And then on the other side, you've got conversion technologies, both commercial and the ones we think are in the pipeline are going to be available very soon. Are going to be proven or disproven fairly soon. And those are grained alcohol, methyl esters, lignocellulosic to ethanol, mixed alcohols. But of those two resources, which one do you think is the hardest to really capture and characterize? It's your feedstocks. Your feedstocks are the challenge. To get them right is really the challenge. And if you think about a balanced research program to get this job done, you should be spending as much on the feedstocks and how you're going to produce them, and smart ideas like your Secretary of Agriculture was suggesting about what kind of crops are really good for us to use in an industrial energy base, and really build on that as much as the technologies are. It's always the biggest challenge for us is to get the resource part of the equation right. And that's where collaboration works best. Because you guys look at that map, you know in your state what your real resources are. And so our challenge, and Alex is really good at it, is to make sure on the resource side we stay in touch with each of the states we're working with and let them contribute. And then let them look and see how honest a projection this is of the biomass resources they have. That's critical. And if you guys collaborate on that, then we're into an age of prospecting for biomass. Our company worked on 5 projects in the last 2 years to build 100 megawatt biomass power facilities. They're really repowering projects. We're turning old coal facilities into biomass power projects. That's 1 million tons of biomass for every one of those projects. And they are going forward. At the same time, we're working in Georgia. We've got a plant there. You've got Range Fuels has announced their Soperton plant. And then you've got chip mills going in, which are shipping a lot of our biomass resources to Europe, where they're using the biomass productively at a very good price. The competition for the resources is really going to get hot. And as you can imagine, the real challenge was going to the PSC meeting, and there was the pulp and paper industry saying, wait a minute, guys, you can't do this without encroaching on our resources. How are we going to divide this up? How are we going to share in these really important resources now? And that is going to be a challenge for every state. How do you manage that? Because you really want the resources to go to the best use. And every state is really trying to face that challenge and say, is it power? Is it a combination of power and fuels? Should it all go to fuels? Should we preserve it for our food crops and things like that, the land use? Big challenges to solve for every single state. The resource data enhancements we're doing now is we'll get the ag crop residues more realistically accounted for, and we're going to try to account for them as if there was a carbon constraint or without a carbon constraint, because there's been a lot of discussion about how much carbon is removed from the soil when you make these kind of land changes and land use changes. And if you take the residues off, how much do you need to leave behind? Well, we know for erosion purposes where we ought to be. Where should we be on the carbon scale? We're going to be able to turn that on and off and look and see what effect that has on what we can really use on the lignocellulosics. We're going to try to get a better map of energy crops. We're working with my company's working with a company called Ab and Go out in Kansas on a ethanol, cellulosic ethanol plant development project. And they're really worried about having enough resources to support that plant and how these herbaceous energy crops are going to play into it. And understanding how they can be grown and how they can be done sustainably is going to be a very important part of their puzzle. And then we'll have the carbon management constraints, and we're expanding our forest biomass supply. Everybody used to say, for biomass projects, when we did them, we'd tell them where all the residuals were. Now we're not talking about residuals anymore. We're talking about materials that would have gone potentially to a pulp industry. We're talking about more premium types of fuels to support this kind of energy development. So you've got to open your box a little bit in terms of the economics that are going to work in this kind of energy situation. We've completed the infrastructure modeling in these areas. These are some of the new technology models we're adding. So when you look at this report, you can understand, hey, how do some of these other players may work out? For me, one of the interesting ones is butanol. There's some renewed interest in that. It's a huge challenge to make a fuel switch from where we're going, ethanol, to butanol. But butanol has some very attractive properties, frankly. And it's basically the same type of process of pretreatment, of hydrolysis, and fermentation. You just use different enzymes and different bugs when it comes to the fermentation step. But butanol has some very interesting characteristics. High moisture biomass, there's a lot of what we call wet biomass. Don Stevens from PNNL can talk about that subject at length because of the kind of technologies they've developed for it. But there's a huge amount of manure resources, these kinds of things. If they can be put to work in a biorefinery situation, and they've been attempted with EER down in Meade, Nebraska, to use the gases produced from digesters to run the ethanol plant. So here you are incorporating other biomass resources to make your plant run. And that's what we think those resources are best used for, is really to produce the methane gas and use that productively in a biorefinery. We are looking at pulp and mill conversions in some parts of the company. Pulp mills, as you know, pulp industry has really gone on a downtrend. If they had other products they could produce in the same time, it could be very make them more profitable, that could be a win-win situation. They already have the infrastructure in place. So we're looking at some technologies for that. And we are interested, it was interesting he mentioned algae. I thought if I brought up algae in Montana, people might look at me sideways, but we're looking at algae conversion to biodiesel. We think that's got a long road to hoe. In terms of the oils that are produced in algae, it's like 10 times what it is for soy. They're real oil producers, these little microalgae. And it's more like an industrial crop because you're growing them in a very contained atmosphere, but you're producing a lot of energy feedstocks in a small space, but at a high capital cost. So can you pull that off, and can you engineer these little microalgae to really do what you want? And if you can, they have a very special potential because they can also be used for food materials. They already are. So they have multiple uses in the long run. And then the spatial analysis is expanding in what we can do there, particularly pipeline integration, try to get the pipelines integrated so we understand how we can get, if we produce these materials, can we get them to the rest of the country, particularly in the areas that overproduce more than they need locally. For the Western governors, they're also using this national biorefinery siting model to help with their look at how biomass fits into these renewable energy zones. So that's an application for the states. But our key to success is that what we do help inform you folks in the states to make some decisions about what your biomass choices are. That's really what we're after. And so the kind of projects where this has really paid off is the modeling work has been used in California for their low carbon fuel standard. I'm working with NYSERDA in New York to develop their biomass roadmap, like you guys are trying to come up with a vision, what's best for us here. And we're using the national model actually to model biorefinery development in the New York region so they can understand what the possibilities could be there, okay? So, and then raised source data and mapping requests have been from a lot of the states. So if we don't put this work to work for you, we really haven't done our job. And that's just a list of publications and things that we've gotten the resources out and gotten the information out for people. So I want to leave you one last thought. This is a very powerful model. It's fairly realistic because it takes into account road networks, pipelines, how you move the products, because that's really important. And if anybody understands biomass, the transportation costs can eat you up fast if you don't do it smartly in a way to get your product to be cost effective. And then I think the other message I'd like you to think about is if you look at our team, what it took for us to solve this problem and to work on this kind of thing, we do all the renewable energies in our company. I can do any solar project with a resource engineer, an electrical engineer, and then 2 financial experts, okay? I can do any wind project with my resource engineer. I have a resource engineer who's really good at mapping wind resources and using GIS analysis with, again, an electrical and probably a structural engineer, and then 4 financial experts to get it done. To do work in biomass, I've got to have on staff, we have foresters, we have agronomists, we have people who understand what it takes to build the infrastructure and move those materials off the field, harvest it, move it off the field, get it to the plant. I have process engineers who understand chemical processing. I have electrical and mechanical engineers who understand power production. And then we need to know how it's going to get out and distributed from there. And so we have people who are really smart on the infrastructure for moving goods to the markets. And then I have 2 financial experts. But you can see what it takes to do biomass projects. It requires a huge amount of collaboration and skills. And if you don't put all the skills together, biomass won't develop in your state. You really need to pull together and bring all those talents together. The people who understand the ag side, the people who understand the process side, to make it work. It's a whole lot easier to do, as my guys know, to do a wind and a solar project than it is to do a biomass project. Biomass projects have a gestation period of years to develop everything you need. I thank you for your patience and time.